The amber lighting of Meridian, Boston's most acclaimed fine dining establishment, cast a warm glow across the polished mahogany and white linen that defined the space. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, their facets fragmenting light into prismatic patterns that danced across the walls. It was the kind of restaurant where conversations were conducted in measured tones, where the staff moved with practiced precision, and where the clientele understood the unspoken rules of such rarefied environments. Denzel Washington sat at a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the restaurant's elegant expanse. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that accentuated his still athletic frame, he maintained the quiet dignity that had become his trademark both on and off screen. The subtle gray at his temples only enhanced the gravitas he had carried since his earliest roles. Tonight was meant to be a working dinner with his longtime producer, Martin Keller, to discuss the direction of their next project, a documentary series exploring racial reconciliation in America's most divided cities. The network is pushing for something more sensationalist, Martin explained, his fingers drumming lightly against the stem of his wine glass. They want confrontation, heated debates, the kind of content that generates clips that go viral. Washington's expression remained neutral, but a slight furrow appeared between his brows. "That's exactly the approach I don't want to take," he replied, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of warmth and authority. "We've had enough shouting matches disguised as dialogue. What we need is actual conversation." The restaurant hummed around them with the gentle cadence of cutlery against fine china, the occasional burst of restrained laughter, and the subtle notes of a live piano playing in the corner. It was an orchestrated atmosphere of refinement, one that Clayton Mercer seemed determined to disrupt. "I'm just saying, people like you always get the benefit of the doubt," Mercer said, his voice carrying across the restaurant in a way that made heads turn. He was seated 3 tables away from Washington, speaking to the maitre d', who had politely informed him that his reservation couldn't be located, while people like me get questioned at every turn. At 53, Mercer carried himself with the defensive posture of someone who had spent a lifetime feeling scrutinized. His tailored navy suit and designer glasses spoke of financial success, but the tightness in his jaw revealed a man perpetually braced for confrontation. As the CEO of a successful tech consultancy, he was accustomed to commanding respect in business settings, which made the current situation all the more galling to him. The maitre d', a young woman whose professional composure was being tested, kept her voice low. "Sir, I assure you we're checking our system. If you could please keep your voice down while we sort this out." "Keep my voice down?" Mercer's volume increased deliberately. "So I can be invisible like you want? Like all of us should be?" Several diners glanced over and then quickly away, enacting that particular urban ritual of feigned disinterest in the face of public discomfort. A couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, the woman's eyes widening in recognition as she noticed Washington observing the scene. Washington glanced back at Martin, who leaned in. "Ignore it. Not your problem tonight. We've got enough challenges with the project." But something in Washington's expression shifted as he watched Mercer's gestures become more animated, as the man's rhetoric became increasingly charged with racial undertones directed at the staff and other patrons. The actor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment but in recognition, the recognition of a moment that required response rather than passive observation. At a small table in the corner sat 12-year-old Elijah Carter, dining with his mother, Rebecca, a food critic for the Boston Globe. The boy's attention had been drawn to the escalating scene, his eyes moving between the angry man and Denzel Washington, whom he immediately recognized from the Malcolm X poster that hung in his bedroom. Elijah's father had shown him the film when he was 10, explaining its importance with the solemnity of passing down essential knowledge. Elijah watched as Washington excused himself from his table, adjusting his cuffs, a deliberate, measured action that seemed to center him before approaching Mercer's table. The boy felt a flutter of anticipation in his chest, the same feeling he got before the climactic scene of a movie. "Excuse me," Washington said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded screens for decades. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation." The restaurant seemed to still, the ambient noise fading as Mercer turned, momentarily disarmed by the recognition of who was addressing him. Several diners reached discreetly for their phones, anticipating a moment worthy of documentation in the age of viral content. "Mr. Washington," he said, surprise temporarily displacing his anger. "Well, this is unexpected." "Life often is," Washington replied, gesturing to the empty chair opposite Mercer. "May I join you for a moment?" Mercer's nod was almost involuntary, his previous grievance temporarily forgotten in the presence of celebrity. The maitre d' stepped back, relief and curiosity mingling in her expression. "You seemed upset about something," Washington continued once seated, his posture relaxed yet dignified. "Something that feels deeply personal to you." Mercer's jaw tightened, the initial shock of the actor's approach wearing off as his original grievance resurfaced. "With all due respect, you wouldn't understand. You live in a different world. Different in some ways," Washington acknowledged, his fingers lightly interlaced on the table between them. "The same in others. But I'm curious about what made you so certain that what happened here was about the color of your skin, rather than, perhaps, a simple administrative error." The directness of the question seemed to catch Mercer off guard. "Because it always is," he replied, but there was the slightest hesitation now. Every closed door, every second glance, every misunderstanding like this one. Washington nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Those experiences shape us. I won't deny that. I've had my share of doors that wouldn't open. But the question becomes, what do we do with that experience? Does it become a lens through which we view every interaction, or a chapter in a longer story we're writing?" Mercer's eyes narrowed. "That's easy for you to say. You're Denzel Washington. The rules are different for you. Now, perhaps," Washington conceded. "But I wasn't born Denzel Washington, the actor. I was born a black boy in Mount Vernon with no guarantees. The journey between those 2 points wasn't without its obstacles." From across the restaurant, Elijah watched the interaction with rapt attention, his dinner forgotten. He noticed how Washington maintained steady eye contact, how his hands remained open and visible on the table, how he leaned slightly forward, all the nonverbal cues his father had taught him about respectful engagement. "Mom," Elijah whispered, his eyes still fixed on the two men. "I need to do something." Rebecca Carter looked up from her notebook where she'd been jotting impressions of the restaurant's new seasonal menu. At 43, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in her expertise. As one of the few black food critics for a major newspaper, she had navigated her share of spaces where her presence was unexpected. "Elijah, this isn't our conversation," she cautioned, though her expression was more curious than admonishing. But Elijah was already slipping from his chair, drawn to the exchange by something he couldn't quite articulate, perhaps the same instinct that had led his father into a career of mediation and conflict resolution. The boy moved across the restaurant with purposeful steps, his 12-year-old frame straight-backed and determined. The evening that had begun as an ordinary Tuesday at Meridian was transforming into something none of the participants could have anticipated, a convergence of perspectives that would challenge assumptions and perhaps open doors to understanding that had previously remained closed. Elijah approached the table where Washington and Mercer sat engaged in their increasingly tense conversation. The restaurant's ambient sound seemed to recede as he drew closer, as though the space itself were acknowledging the significance of what was unfolding. Several diners watched with thinly veiled interest, forks poised mid-air, wine glasses temporarily forgotten. "They didn't lose your reservation," the boy said simply, standing at the edge of the table. Both men turned to look at him, Mercer with irritation, Washington with curious interest. In the momentary silence that followed, Elijah felt a flutter of doubt, but then remembered his father's voice. Truth spoken with respect deserves to be heard, regardless of where it comes from. "Excuse me," Mercer said, his tone carrying the dismissiveness adults often reserve for children who insert themselves into grown-up conversations. Washington, however, studied the boy with attentive interest, his expression open and receptive. "The couple at table 14, Elijah continued, his voice steady despite the attention now directed at him. "They were supposed to leave 30 minutes ago but ordered dessert at the last minute. The timing got messed up. I heard the staff talking about it when I went to the restroom." The simplicity of the explanation hung in the air between them. Washington's expression softened into something like appreciation, while Mercer seemed caught between dismissal and consideration. "Young man," Washington said gently, "thank you for sharing that perspective. Sometimes we miss the simpler explanations when we're prepared to see complexity." From across the restaurant, Rebecca watched her son with a mixture of apprehension and pride. She recognized in his intervention the same unflinching directness that had characterized her late husband's approach to conflict resolution. Marcus had possessed an almost uncanny ability to distill tense situations to their essence. to identify the underlying factors that others missed in their emotional reactions. Elijah nodded at Washington's acknowledgement, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The cover was faded blue leather, embossed with his father's initials. "I keep this to remember things people say that matter. My dad used to say that understanding comes before judgment, that when we judge first, we stop listening." Something in the boy's words seemed to penetrate Mercer's armor. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the defensive squaring of his shoulders relaxing by degrees. "Your dad sounds like a wise man," Washington said. "He was," Elijah replied, running his thumb along the notebook's worn edge. "He died 3 years ago, but he also said that being right isn't the same as being kind, and sometimes kindness matters more." The statement hung in the air, simple yet profound, creating a moment of shared vulnerability that transcended the initial conflict. Mercer looked away briefly, his expression unreadable. "I apologize for interrupting," Elijah added, suddenly aware of his boldness. "But sometimes people get stuck seeing only one side of things, and my dad said that's when a new voice can help." Washington exchanged a glance with Mercer, a silent communication passing between them. "I think your voice was exactly what this conversation needed," the actor said. "What's your name?" "Elijah Carter." "Well, Elijah Carter, your father's wisdom lives on through you. That's a powerful legacy." The maitre d' approached the table, her professional composure restored. "Mr. Mercer, we've sorted out the situation. A table has become available, and we'd be honored to serve you. Please accept our sincere apologies for the confusion." Mercer hesitated, the readiness to continue his complaint visibly warring with something new, perhaps the realization that he had been primed to see discrimination where there might have been mere administrative error. The weight of Washington's presence and the unexpected wisdom of a child had created a space for reconsideration. "Thank you," he said finally, his tone measured. "I appreciate your efforts to resolve the situation." Washington stood, extending his hand to Mercer. "Enjoy your dinner. Perhaps we can continue our conversation another time." As Mercer was led to his table, Washington turned to Elijah. "That was a brave thing you did, stepping into an adult conversation that way. Not many would have the courage." Elijah shrugged, a gesture that belied the depth of his response. "My mom says that staying silent when you could make things better is its own kind of wrong." Washington glanced across the restaurant to where Rebecca sat watching the interaction. She offered a small nod of acknowledgement. "Your mother sounds as wise as your father," he said. "Would you introduce me?" As they walked back to Rebecca's table, various diners pretended not to watch, though the energy in the restaurant had shifted perceptibly. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had transformed into something more complex and potentially meaningful. "Mom, this is Mr. Washington," Elijah said with unnecessary formality as they reached the table. Rebecca extended her hand. "Rebecca Carter, food critic for the Globe and apparently mother to Boston's youngest diplomat." Washington smiled, the expression warming his features. "Your son has quite a perspective. He just diffused a situation I wasn't sure how to navigate." "He gets that from his father," Rebecca said, a note of both pride and wistfulness in her voice. "Marcus had a gift for seeing past the surface of conflicts. He was a community mediator for the city. Dad always said that most fights aren't really about what people think they're fighting about," Elijah added, sliding back into his seat. Washington nodded thoughtfully. "That's been my experience as well. May I join you for a moment?" At Rebecca's gesture of welcome, he sat, his presence transforming their corner table into the center of the restaurant's subtle attention. A waiter appeared almost immediately, refreshing water glasses with practiced efficiency. "I've been working on a documentary series," Washington explained, "about difficult conversations across racial and cultural divides. What just happened here, that's exactly the kind of dynamic we're trying to explore." Rebecca's professional interest was piqued. "That sounds like important work, especially in Boston with its complicated history." "The city of contradictions," Washington agreed. "Progressive politics alongside persistent segregation. It's emblematic of the national challenge." Elijah listened intently, absorbing the adult conversation while observing Mercer at his newly assigned table. The man sat alone, his phone untouched beside his plate, an unusual sight in contemporary dining. There was something in his solitude that called to Elijah's sense of empathy, a quality he had inherited from both parents. "Mr. Washington," he said, interrupting the conversation about documentary approaches, "I think we should invite Mr. Mercer to join us." The suggestion hung in the air, unexpected yet somehow perfectly aligned with the evening's unfolding narrative. Washington studied the boy, recognizing in him a natural understanding of restorative justice that many adults never achieved. "That's a generous thought," he said carefully, "but he might prefer his privacy after what happened. Or he might be sitting there feeling worse than before," Elijah countered. "Dad said that true resolution only happens when people come back together after conflict, not when they walk away from it." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Washington, a silent communication between adults who recognized wisdom regardless of its source. "Elijah has his father's instincts," she said simply. Washington nodded, making his decision. "Then let's extend the invitation. The worst he can say is no." As Washington rose to approach Mercer's table, the restaurant seemed to collectively hold its breath. The piano player, sensing the moment, transitioned to a softer melody that floated through the space like a gentle current, connecting the disparate elements of this unexpected evening. What had begun as a confrontation was evolving into something far more complex, a potential bridge across divides that usually remained uncrossed, facilitated by the unexpected wisdom of a child who carried his father's legacy of peacemaking. In this exclusive Boston restaurant, far from cameras or public scrutiny, a more authentic version of the dialogue Washington hoped to capture in his documentary was unfolding organically. The evening had transformed into something none of the participants could have anticipated when they entered Meridian's elegant confines hours earlier. The original tables had been abandoned in favor of a larger round one in a semi-private alcove, where Denzel Washington, Clayton Mercer, Rebecca Carter, and young Elijah now sat engaged in a conversation that had traversed territories from personal experience to systemic challenges, from perceived slights to genuine grievances. The restaurant's staff, sensing the importance of the impromptu gathering, maintained a respectful distance, appearing only to refresh drinks or clear plates with practiced discretion. Around them, the dining room had begun to empty as the evening progressed, creating an increased sense of intimacy for their continued dialogue. "The problem," Mercer was saying, his initial defensiveness having given way to a more thoughtful engagement, "is that you never know which time it is, which slight is just poor service, and which one is something more insidious." He rotated his wine glass slowly, watching the burgundy liquid catch the light. "After a while, you start to assume it's always the latter, because that feels safer somehow." Washington nodded, his expression reflective. "It's a protective mechanism. I understand it. I've lived it." He leaned forward slightly. "But it comes with a cost. It changes how we move through the world, how we interact with others, how much benefit of the doubt we're willing to extend. It's like wearing armor all the time," Elijah interjected, drawing on a metaphor his father had often used, "even when there's no battle." The adults turned to him with varying expressions of surprise, not at his participation, which had become an accepted part of their unusual dinner, but at the aptness of his observation. "That's exactly it," Mercer said, studying the boy with newfound respect. "Armor that gets heavier the longer you wear it, but feels too dangerous to remove." Rebecca, who had been mostly observing rather than participating, now entered the conversation. Marcus, Elijah's father, used to talk about selective vulnerability as a strategic choice, about choosing when to lower the armor intentionally rather than having it forcibly removed or keeping it on until you collapse under its weight. "Your husband sounds like someone I would have valued knowing," Washington said. A soft smile touched Rebecca's lips. "He had a gift for bringing clarity to complex situations. After he died, I found notebooks filled with observations about human behavior, insights from his meditation work. That's where Elijah got the idea for his own notebook." Elijah reached into his pocket and withdrew the worn blue journal, placing it carefully on the table. "I write down things that matter, things that help make sense of people." Mercer regarded the notebook with unexpected gentleness. "May I ask what you've written about tonight?" Elijah hesitated, then opened to a fresh page where he had been jotting observations throughout the evening. His handwriting was neat but distinctly that of a child, with occasional creative spellings and arrows connecting related thoughts. "Sometimes people are looking so hard for one kind of problem that they miss seeing another kind of solution," he read. "Mr. Washington treats everyone like they matter, even when they're angry. This makes them listen better." Washington's expression registered genuine surprise at the observation, the kind of unguarded reaction rarely captured by cameras. "That's remarkably perceptive, Elijah." The boy shrugged, a gesture reminiscent of his earlier response to praise. "I just watch and listen. That's what Dad taught me." Rebecca placed a hand gently on her son's shoulder, pride evident in her expression. He absorbs everything. Sometimes I forget he's only 12. 12 going on 40, Mercer added with the first genuine smile he had displayed all evening. The tension that had defined his initial presence had gradually dissipated throughout their conversation, replaced by a thoughtfulness that suggested internal recalibration. "Mr. Washington," Elijah said, returning to an earlier thread of their conversation, "you said you're making a documentary about hard conversations. Is it just going to show people arguing, or will it show how they figure things out after?" The question, delivered with a child's directness yet containing the insight of a seasoned documentarian, created a moment of consideration for Washington. "That's actually something we've been wrestling with in the production meetings. The network wants conflict because conflict drives viewership. But resolution, real, meaningful resolution, that's harder to capture in a way that holds attention. But that's the important part," Elijah insisted. "Otherwise, people just see more fighting and think that's normal." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Washington, a silent acknowledgement of the wisdom in her son's observation. "Out of the mouths of babes," she said softly. Mercer, who had been quietly reflective for several minutes, leaned forward. "What if your documentary included not just the facilitated conversations you're planning, but also unexpected moments like this one?" He gestured to encompass their table. "Real interactions that weren't staged or planned." Washington studied him with renewed interest. "That's actually much closer to my original vision, before network executives got involved. I'm on the board of the Boston Community Foundation," Mercer continued, his tone shifting to one of tentative proposition. "We fund initiatives across the city, including several focused on racial dialogue and reconciliation. Perhaps there's a way to support a version of your project that maintains its integrity." The offer hung in the air, representing not just a potential professional collaboration, but a symbolic bridging of the gulf that had existed between the two men when the evening began. It was Elijah who broke the thoughtful silence that followed. "See," he said, with the satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. "When people actually talk instead of just being mad, they find ways to work together." The adults couldn't help but laugh, not at the boy's observation, but at the simple truth it contained, and the earnest delivery that cut through the complexity they had constructed around it. "From the mouths of babes indeed," Washington said, raising his water glass in a small toast to Elijah. Outside the restaurant's windows, Boston's evening landscape spread out in a tapestry of lights against the darkness. Inside, at a table that had become an unexpected forum for meaningful exchange, 4 individuals from different walks of life had created a space where authentic dialogue transcended the initial conflict that had brought them together. As their unusual dinner neared its conclusion, there was a sense among them that something valuable had transpired, something worth preserving and perhaps replicating. The evening had become not just an anecdote to recount at future dinner parties, but a template for possibility in a world where such genuine exchanges across divides had become increasingly rare. Washington caught Elijah's eye and offered a small nod of acknowledgement, one that recognized the critical role the boy had played in transforming what could have been merely another uncomfortable public confrontation into something constructive and potentially healing. In that moment, a contract of sorts was established between them, an unspoken agreement that what had been started here would not end with the evening's conclusion. The restaurant continued its gentle symphony of ambient sounds, distant conversations, the clink of glasses, the subtle notes of the piano. But for those at the table, these had become merely the backdrop to a more meaningful harmony they had created together, note by unexpected note. 3 weeks after the unexpected encounter at Meridian, the Carters' modest Dorchester apartment was transformed by the presence of a professional film crew. Cables snaked across the hardwood floors, lighting equipment softened the afternoon shadows, and a sound technician adjusted microphone levels with meticulous attention to detail. Seated in the living room, a warm space filled with books and family photographs, were Denzel Washington, Clayton Mercer, Rebecca, and Elijah. "Just forget the cameras are here," Washington instructed, though he was well aware of the near impossibility of such a request. "We're just continuing the conversation we started that night." The evening at Meridian had concluded with an exchange of contact information and tentative plans to incorporate their unexpected encounter into Washington's documentary project. What none of them had anticipated was how quickly those plans would materialize. or how their impromptu dinner would evolve into the centerpiece of a reimagined approach to the series. The network actually responded positively to the new direction, Washington explained as the crew made final adjustments. They recognized that authentic moments of connection might ultimately be more compelling than manufactured confrontation. Rebecca, dressed with the polished professionalism she brought to her public-facing role as a critic, regarded the transformation of her living space with bemused acceptance. Marcus would have loved this, she mused. His work was always about creating spaces for difficult conversations. He just never had Hollywood production values to work with. Elijah, for his part, appeared remarkably unfazed by the cameras. Seated next to his mother on the sofa, he maintained the same direct gaze and attentive posture that had characterized his presence at Meridian. His blue notebook rested on his lap, a tangible connection to his father's legacy that had become something of a talisman for their ongoing dialogue. Mercer, who had arrived precisely on time, with the careful punctuality of someone determined to make a favorable impression, had gradually relaxed as they reviewed the structure of the planned conversation. The defensive energy that had defined his initial appearance at the restaurant had evolved into something more measured, still vigilant, but no longer primed for combat. "We're rolling," the director announced, a slender woman whose credentials included several award-winning documentaries on social justice themes. She nodded to Washington, silently transferring leadership of the moment. 3 weeks ago, Washington began, his voice carrying the same thoughtful cadence that had distinguished his most powerful screen roles. The four of us met under unusual circumstances. What began as a confrontation evolved into something none of us expected, a genuine dialogue across differences that typically remain unaddressed in public spaces. The cameras captured the subtle play of expressions across each face. Mercer's reflective nod, Rebecca's quiet attentiveness, Elijah's unwavering focus. "Clayton," Washington continued, turning toward the man who had been his adversary and was now, improbably, something closer to a collaborator. "When you look back at that evening, what stands out to you most?" Mercer considered the question with the deliberation of someone who had spent considerable time in reflection. "Honestly, my initial assumption that I knew exactly what was happening and why." He adjusted his position slightly, the gesture of someone still finding his comfort with vulnerability. "I walked into that restaurant carrying the weight of 100 previous experiences, ready to interpret every interaction through that lens." "Which isn't entirely irrational," Washington acknowledged. "Our experiences shape our expectations." "No, it's not irrational," Mercer agreed, "but it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I was so primed to find discrimination that I couldn't consider alternative explanations." He glanced at Elijah, "Until someone offered one that I couldn't dismiss." The boy accepted this acknowledgement with characteristic equanimity, his expression serious yet unburdened by the heaviness of the topics being discussed. "Elijah," Washington said, turning to him, "you stepped into an adult conversation that night in a way that changed its direction entirely. What made you decide to do that?" The boy glanced down at his notebook briefly, then met Washington's gaze with the directness that had become his trademark. "It looked like people were stuck seeing just one side of things. Dad always said that's when a new perspective can help most." He paused, searching for the right words. "And I knew the real reason about the reservation mix-up because I was paying attention when no one thought I was." "The power of being underestimated," Rebecca added softly. "Children often see what adults miss because we don't expect them to be observant." Washington nodded. "That's a profound insight, and it speaks to one of the core themes we're exploring in this documentary: how our preconceptions limit what we're able to perceive and understand." The conversation flowed with a natural rhythm that belied the presence of cameras and crew. They revisited the events of that evening, but more importantly, they explored the ripple effects that had followed, how a single interaction had catalyzed reflections and reconsiderations that extended far beyond the moment itself. Mercer spoke about reassessing other instances he had automatically attributed to racial bias, questioning whether some might have had more mundane explanations. "It's not that discrimination doesn't exist," he clarified. "It's that automatically assuming its presence in every situation robs me of the ability to respond appropriately to what's actually happening." Rebecca shared her experiences navigating predominantly white spaces as a food critic, balancing the need to represent Black perspectives in culinary journalism, while resisting being tokenized or limited to covering only certain types of cuisine. "There's a delicate dance between acknowledging very real barriers and refusing to be defined by them," she explained. Marcus was masterful at that balance. I'm still learning. Throughout it all, Elijah contributed observations that repeatedly shifted the adults' perspectives, not through sophisticated rhetoric or learned analysis, but through the clarifying power of unencumbered perception. His father's wisdom, channeled through the boy's direct expression, created moments of illumination that the documentary crew captured with quiet appreciation. As the formal interview portion concluded and the crew began breaking down equipment, Washington drew Elijah aside to a quiet corner of the apartment. "I have something for you," he said, presenting a small, carefully wrapped package. "A token of appreciation for the wisdom you've shared with us." Elijah unwrapped the gift with careful attention, revealing a leather-bound journal of exceptional quality, embossed with his initials in gold leaf. "For your observations," Washington explained. "When you fill your father's notebook, this one will be waiting." The boy ran his fingers over the embossed leather with reverent appreciation, understanding the symbolic passing of a torch represented by the gift. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, with the directness that characterized all his interactions, "Will you sign it?" Washington smiled, taking the journal back and inscribing a brief message on the first page before returning it to Elijah. The boy read the message silently, his expression revealing that the words had found their mark. Across the room, Rebecca and Mercer were engaged in conversation with the director, discussing potential community screenings of the documentary once it was completed. The project had evolved from its original conception into something more nuanced, an exploration not just of racial divides and their manifestations, but of the moments of connection that pointed toward possibilities for reconciliation. "Mr. Washington," Elijah said, looking up from the journal, "do you think this will actually change anything? People watching the documentary, I mean." The actor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Change is rarely dramatic or sudden," he replied. "It happens in small moments, in shifts of perspective that accumulate over time." He gestured toward where Mercer and Rebecca stood talking. 3 weeks ago, that conversation wouldn't have been possible. Small changes, multiplied across many interactions. That's how transformation happens. Elijah nodded, processing this response with the thoughtfulness that made him seem so much older than his years. "Dad used to say that peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice and understanding." "Your father was a wise man," Washington said, "not for the first time. And his wisdom lives on through you. That's a powerful legacy, Elijah." As the crew completed their work and the apartment gradually returned to its normal state, there was a sense among all present that they had participated in something meaningful, not just the creation of content for a documentary, but the cultivation of authentic dialogue across differences that typically remained unaddressed. Washington's phone chimed with a message from his producer, reminding him of another commitment that evening. As he prepared to leave, he took a moment to address the small group that had, through circumstance and choice, become connected in unexpected ways. "What began as a chance encounter has evolved into something none of us could have anticipated," he said, a reminder that the most important conversations often happen in unexpected places, with unexpected participants. He glanced at Elijah, "And that wisdom can come from voices we might otherwise overlook." The boy accepted this acknowledgement with characteristic grace, his expression revealing both pride and a wisdom beyond his years. Outside the Carters' apartment building, as they waited for their respective cars, Mercer turned to Washington. "You could have ignored what was happening that night at Meridian. Most celebrities would have." "Perhaps," Washington acknowledged. "But then we all would have missed an important lesson." He glanced back toward the building where Elijah and Rebecca still stood in the doorway. "Sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from unexpected sources." As they parted ways that afternoon, each carried with them something they hadn't possessed before their chance encounter. Washington, new inspiration for a project that had nearly been compromised by commercial pressures. Mercer, a willingness to question long-held assumptions about his experiences. Rebecca, a renewed connection to her late husband's work through their son's unexpected embodiment of his principles. And Elijah, the quiet confidence that came from knowing his father's teachings continued to matter in the world. The documentary would eventually air to critical acclaim, praised for its authentic portrayal of both conflict and connection across racial divides. But more significant than its public reception were the private transformations it represented, the small yet meaningful shifts in perception and understanding that had begun with an unexpected confrontation in a Boston restaurant and evolved into something none of the participants could have anticipated. In the final scene of the documentary, The camera captured Elijah sitting on the steps of his apartment building, his father's worn blue notebook in one hand and Washington's gift in the other. When asked what he hoped people would take away from watching the film, the boy considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness before offering the simple wisdom that had come to define his role in their unlikely story. That most of the time, people aren't really fighting about what they think they're fighting about. And when you figure out what they're really fighting about, that's when you can start fixing things instead of just being angry. As the credits rolled over this final image, viewers were left with not just the documentation of a meaningful exchange, but a template for possibility in a world where such genuine dialogue across divides had become increasingly rare. A reminder that sometimes the wisdom needed to bridge seemingly insurmountable gaps comes from the most unexpected sources.